Thank you, I appreciate that.
I'm making more coffee. It'll be ready in a minute.
I'm not fitting.
He's not kidding.
Shabbat Shalom. Hallelujah. Welcome back.
Shabbat Shalom.
Yeah. Hallelujah. It's time for a teaching. I want to bring in a teaching today from Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 11. We've been looking at Devarim for the last so many weeks, like 7 or 8 weeks or whatever. It's been really a fascinating book. And there's a lot of details. I mean, I don't know if you all have ever had the experience of really just working slowly through the book of Deuteronomy and really just trying to grasp the details of it. There really is a lot that Moshe is sharing. The occasion, of course, just a quick review, is that they're about ready to enter into the promised land, and the 40 years are nearly past, and Moshe is reviewing what happened during those 40 years and the rebellion of the sons of Israel, and also Yahweh's plea that they would listen to his commandments, because he wants to do right by his people. He wants to fulfill his promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wants to bring the people into the land. And but there are certain stipulations. I mean, there are certain requirements, and I think we looked at that last week in Devarim chapter 10. The requirements: the Father wants us to love him and serve him with all of our heart and strength and cling to him, and obey his word. Those are all requirements, prerequisites to entering into the land. And it's precisely because they didn't obey his commandments and they rebelled against him that first generation didn't go in. And so let this be a lesson to us, and this is, of course, the purpose of it being here. It's for us. These things were written down for us so that we would learn the lessons. We can't afford to think that, God works differently now. He was tough on his people back then. He gave them laws they couldn't handle and so forth, and that's why they rebelled. He put them through tough situations. But Elohim is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He doesn't change. He still needs to test his people because he knows what's in our heart, as we talked about in a previous session. But we don't always know what's in our heart. Our hearts are deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? It says in the scriptures. And so the Father wants to draw these things out of us. And so he puts us through some tough times, maybe hungering, thirsting, whatever that looks like for each one of us. He puts us through situations that test our resolve to serve him. We can say it with our lips. We can confess it and talk about how we love him and how Jesus or Yeshua died for us. But until we're faced with some of the trials, we don't really know. We may be deceiving ourselves. And so that's what he wants to do. He put our ancestors through the wilderness experience to see what was in their heart. And he's going to do the same for us today. He's going to put us through a wilderness experience. And he's going to test what's in our heart. And, it all depends on the outcome. Are we going to serve him? Are we going to love him like we said with our mouths we're going to love him? Do we really belong to him like we tell others, we're of the family of God and so forth, and Jesus died for our sins? Or not? Are we going to be in rebellion? And so that's what Moses has been talking about in Deuteronomy. He's talking about all those experiences and how the Father is trying to draw us into a place where we really do love him and our actions are in agreement with our words. We're doing what we said we would do. We're not just talking a good talk, but we're walking the walk as well. So Deuteronomy chapter 11 is a continuation of kind of a reviewing of the history of how the Father brought our ancestors out of Egypt and through the wilderness experience in order to fulfill his promises and bring them into the land. And we're going to read a little bit today about the land, and what's in the land that the Father wants to give us as a gift, and how we should act, and what our behavior should look like. And so today's message is entitled Guarding the Trust. Guarding the Trust. I don't know if you are familiar with that term, like from the New Testament, but we're going to see it right here in Deuteronomy chapter 11. So let me get started. We're going to spend a little bit of time on verse 1, like I like to do, in our studies. We're going to probably spend at least a third of our time, or maybe even half of our time, talking about verse 1, because that's where the expression occurs. Deuteronomy 11, verse 1, "You shall therefore love Yahweh your Elohim and keep his charge." And there I've underlined that phrase because we're going to really dig into that. To keep his charge, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments all the days. All the days. And so in this first verse is repeated what we saw in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 6 and possibly a couple of other places where we talked about the word commandment in the singular as being parallel in meaning to covenant. The commandment is the covenant. And when we find it in this form, he's talking about the statutes and the judgments that he gave, not only at Mount Sinai, but that he also gave to Moses when Moses was up on the mountain. He gave him additional instructions, additional laws that the sons of Israel were to follow. And so those included statutes. By the way, statutes, the 10 words are statutes, but there are also described throughout the Torah that some of the other statutes include keeping the Pesach and the pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread. That's a statute. And Shavuot or Pentecost, that's a statute. And what's the Feast of Tabernacles? He calls that a statute. These are laws that are unchanging for his people. And we've lost sight of that in our Christian churches and our upbringing because our fathers and the teachers and preachers inherited lies, and they just kept passing down those falsities about what the Father expects of us. And so we need to get back to that place where we understand that these are still the Father's requirements for us as well. And when we look at the greater Exodus in the prophets, we see that the Father is going to bring us, the people that are alive in that day, hopefully us, into the wilderness to test us before he brings us into the land. So there's always going to be a testing of his people so that he can verify and demonstrate from our own actions that we belong there, that we really are his people, that we're the faithful ones. And so in verse 1, he talks about the statutes and judgments and the commandments. And we've gone into great detail about that before, but there's a different word he uses here that's translated charge. In some of the other English translations, it's translated charge, and possibly some other ways of translating this word. And that's what I want to look at today, because it kind of replaces, like Deuteronomy 4:1 and 6:1, he uses the word mitzvah, commandment. This is the commandment, meaning the covenant. And then he says the statutes and the judgments are what make up this commandment, this covenant commandment that he's given to us. But here a different word is used, translated charge, and it's the word mishmeret in the Hebrew, mishmeret. I looked this up in the Hebrew lexicon, and it says it can be translated as guardians because it comes from the word shamar, which we've also done a number of detailed studies on. Shamar means to keep or to guard, and it's related to the idea of the watchman on the wall who keeps watch over the city. You know, that's his responsibility, is to watch, and you know, if the enemy's coming to attack the city, then he sounds the trumpet and he alerts the people, he alerts the soldiers to get up and get ready to fight. And so guardian, mishmeret, can refer to even a watchtower. It's used at least once in that respect, referring to the place, you know, on the wall where the watchman watches out to keep guard of the city. So mishmeret also actually means, because it comes from the word shamar, it means what is to be preserved or guarded or watched over. The very thing that's to be preserved. A charge is sometimes translated charge, as it is here, or a trust, and that's where I get the translation guard the trust, which you will see in the New Testament probably more frequently than you will in the Old. An obligation, a duty, a service, a watch station. The obligation, duty, or service is kind of like, again, with the watchman, it's his responsibility. That's his job, is to watch, you know, on behalf of the city and to keep guard of the city. The charge includes the statutes and judgments. So in other words, this word mishmeret is also like the word mitzvah in the singular. It's also a parallel or a synonym of the word covenant. It's a charge, it's a responsibility given. And so when he says keep his charge or keep that which he has preserved, he's talking about the covenant commandments, just as he has, again, earlier in the book of Devarim so many times. And so I want to dig into this word and into this concept of keeping the charge. Mishmeret can mean obligation or service or to guard. Sometimes it's translated just simply to guard. The basic idea of the root word mishmeret, which comes again from shamar, is to exercise great care over, like, you know, and that's what guard means, or to keep, or to watch over. You're exercising care over something. You've been given a responsibility, and so this meaning can be seen to underlie the various semantic modifications seen in the verb. So in other words, you're going to see a little piece of this concept of guarding, an obligation to guard or watch over, wherever this word is used. And sometimes it's in different contexts, and so it may be translated a little bit differently, but it still has the underlying meaning of watching over or guarding of something. In combination with other verbs, the meaning is to do carefully or diligently. Secondly, it expresses the careful attention to be paid to the obligations of a covenant, as we see here in Deuteronomy 11:1, to the laws and statutes and so forth, and even the commandments of the covenant as guardians or things that watch over us. And so there's kind of a duality in the usage of this word. It can refer to the commandments as guardians that watch over us, but at the same time it could refer to our responsibility to watch over the commandments, to watch over the duty that's been given to us, the responsibility of taking care of the covenant and firmly walking in the covenant, and of course, as we talked about earlier, passing that down to our children and to our children's children. The importance of keeping covenant with the Father. Frequently the verb is used to speak of personal discipline, the need to take heed in respect to one's life and actions. And that's also related to keeping covenant. Because if we're not watching over the things that the Father has given us to walk in, then we're walking in some other path in some other way, the destiny of which is different from the destiny that we're hoping to arrive at someday. The destiny which has been foreordained by the Father, that we would be adopted as sons and daughters and inherit the kingdom of heaven, for which, you know, we're walking, and for which Messiah died for us, so that he could bring us into that kingdom that is going to be here on the earth. And that's Mishmeret. Mishmeret in the Tanakh Those are all the occurrences, the slide that I'm showing you. And we're going to look at a couple of these just to pick up on how this word mishmeret is used. Genesis, Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, and only once in Deuteronomy. And that's why it popped out at me, because this is the only time this verb occurs here in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 11 verse 1, and it also occurs in several other books of the Bible. A total of, I don't know, what was that, about 25 or 30 times. I didn't count them all. So let me dig into how the word mishmeret is related to guarding his charge, as we're told in the New Testament. As Paul, and we're going to look at Paul too. Paul instructing Timothy to guard the charge that's been given to him, the responsibility that he's been given. So let's lay some background here. The same phrase, guard the charge, occurs in Genesis 26, a couple of verses which I'm fond of reiterating because they're so important to tell us about who Abraham was. It says, I will multiply your descendants. He's talking to Isaac here. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge. These are the same two words. It's shamar and mishmeret used in combination. He's shamar, he's guarding, the mishmeret, those things that are to be guarded or to be protected. He kept my charge. The charge being that Elohim has given his people a responsibility by giving, the statutes and right rulings of the Torah. These are the things we're charged with keeping. Charge there meaning that he's commanded us to walk in that thing, the charge. Maybe the word charge will become clearer as we work through these passages. So Abraham obeyed and he kept his charge, his mishmeret, the commandments, the mitzvah, the statutes, the hukah, and the laws or right rulings, which is the word Torah actually in this verse. Genesis 26:5 is Torah. Also in Exodus 12:6, the word mishmeret is used, and here Moses is talking about the Passover lamb. He says, and you shall keep mishmeret, or guard over, watch over it, the lamb, until the 14th day of the same month, and then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. So there the thing being guarded is the lamb, because they selected that lamb on the 10th day of the month, and they're to watch over it until the 14th day of the month, when at twilight they were to slay the lamb and dip the hyssop in the blood and sprinkle it on their doorposts and so forth. You know the whole story. So the lamb is to be guarded because the Father is entrusting us with it, with the care of this lamb. That's where entrusted comes into play in the same vein as the word guard. Leviticus 8:35, concerning the ordination of the priests, Moses writes, at the doorway of the tent of meeting, moreover, you shall remain day and night for 7 days. This is after they've been anointed, and cleansed for ordination to the priesthood. For 7 days, and keep the charge. They were to guard the responsibility entrusted to them of Yahweh, so that you will not die, for so I have commanded. And so again, the thing entrusted is that he's making these sons of Aaron priests, and they're to follow a certain pattern, a certain specific ritual in their cleansing and in their ordination to be priests. And so this is the charge that they were given, to remain for 7 days, night and day, before Yahweh, before they would actually go into the practice of the services and responsibilities of priests. In Leviticus 18, concerning the mixing of pagan practices and behaviors. We are to guard that which was entrusted to us. He says in Leviticus 18:29 and 30, for whoever does any of these abominations, and he's talking about, I don't want to read the whole passage, but he's talking about not engaging in their worship practices, not engaging in their sexual immoralities and all the perversities that they are involved in. He says, whoever does any of these abominations, those persons who do so shall be cut off from among their people. And thus you are to keep my charge. Keep in the responsibility that I've given you to be a holy people and to obey the commandments, that you do not practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you, so as not to defile yourselves with them. I am Yahweh your Elohim. And so I've given you 4 examples of how mishmeret is used. Actually, in the book of Numbers, it occurs over and over again. I think it was listed in that slide where I showed you. Yeah, Numbers, it occurs like 12 or 15 times, the word mishmeret. And it's referring to a responsibility that they are to follow in terms of keeping the covenant commandments. And so I want to jump next to, with that in mind, with what it means to guard that which is entrusted to you, an expression that was used a number of times in the Old Testament. And I don't think we always, when we read the New Testament, if we don't know the Old Testament, we don't know that Paul is actually quoting from the Old Testament, that he's referring to a law, a statute that was given in the Old Testament, a commandment that the Father gave to his people to guard that which is entrusted to you. And so, in 1 Timothy, let me start here. 1 Timothy 5:21, I solemnly charge you in the presence of Elohim and of Messiah Yahusha and of his chosen angels to guard these principles, these things, without bias, doing nothing in a spirit of partiality. And so Paul's instructing Timothy, and he's giving him this solemn charge, a responsibility to follow through with. And he says, you're to guard these things. Actually, the word principles or things isn't there in the Greek. He's referring to the laws that were given in the covenant, that Timothy is to guard these things, these principles, these things that the Father has given in his law, and without bias. Because he's been given, instructions that come from the Torah to Timothy, and now he's saying, I solemnly charge you to guard these things. It was Timothy and everyone who calls on the name of the Father, who walks in his ways, to diligently keep watch over these things, to do them. Again, in 1 Timothy 6, the next chapter, he's still writing to Timothy. He says, I charge you in the presence of Elohim, who gives life to all things, and of Messiah Yahusha, who testified the good confession before Pontius Pilate, that you keep the commandment without stain or reproach until the appearing of our Lord Yahushua Messiah. And the word commandment here is, surprisingly, but not surprisingly, the singular form. It's the commandment. And so what is he referring to? Just, yeah, the Torah, the covenant, again. When he says keep the commandment, he's not referring just to one single commandment that he maybe just gave them. Like, don't look down on the youth or whatever. He gave a lot of instructions and commandments. But here he's referring to guarding the covenant commandment, the whole body of covenant laws that the Father has given to his people. And so again, this is another instance of, we read this through the eyes of somebody who studies the New Testament, and we don't realize that he's talking about what was given in the Old through the law. That the covenant is what is to be guarded by his people with diligence, because it's in diligently obeying the covenant laws that the Father is going to lead us into the promised land. 1 Timothy 6:20 again, Paul talks about it. He says, "O Timothy, guard that which is committed to thy trust." And this is where the expression "guard the trust" comes from. And it literally, the word trust there is from the Greek word paratheke, which means something that has been entrusted to another for faithful keeping, or watching over, or guarding, like the armed guards that run around in armored trucks because they're guarding something of great value, and it's their responsibility to keep that thing, watch over it, and bring it to its destination. That's why they're armed, because everybody, if they weren't armed, they'd be robbed daily, people would just take it. So the idea of keeping or watching over, again, the word paratheke means goods placed in trust, a deposit or a trust. And so where he talks in another place about the deposit that was given to you, he's talking about this trust, the trust of responsibility to keep watch over the covenant commandments that the Father has given. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul talks about it again. Verses 13 through 15, he says, "Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar?" And so the subject matter here is that the people who do the service of Elohim deserve to make their living from the altar, or the service that they're performing. And so also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. And this is something we don't read in the gospels, in the four gospels, that that Yeshua Messiah instructed his disciples to get their living from the gospel. It's not very clear at all, but Paul is saying that he did say this. Not everything that we have in the gospels is everything that Yeshua spoke about. We just have little glimpses and little pieces and parts of the instructions and the teachings that he gave. But the Messiah did instruct his disciples that they would receive their living from the gospel, which is why he called them away. Peter from his fishing boats, and Matthew from his tax collector booth, and all the rest, he called them to come and follow him, because they were going to begin to live off of the service that they were performing. In terms of food and clothing and all of those things. And so he says, "But I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things so that it will be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than to have any man make his boast on an empty one." And so Paul is explaining that even though he has this right to receive his living from the gospel, he hasn't always taken advantage of that right, but that he worked with his own hands. Wherever there was lack, he provided for himself through working with his hands. He goes on to say, "For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion." And this is Paul's motivation, is that he recognizes this responsibility that he's been given, and he has to carry it out. He's under, he's under that stewardship, which he says next, "For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel, for if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me." And so again, this is from Deuteronomy 11:1, is that the Father has given a stewardship to each one of us. Paul's talking about his own stewardship, which he is under compulsion to perform, but each one of us have been given a stewardship, a responsibility in the Father through the giftings that he's given us, through the message he's taught us, that we are to be, he has entrusted us with this message, and we need to faithfully carry out this responsibility to others in order to please the Father, because this is what he's given us to do. So then Paul says, what then is my reward? Because he's not taking full advantage of his right to receive monies and helps and other things from believers. He says, what is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. So Paul's trust, the trust that's been given to Paul, which he then was passing on as information to Timothy, and for all those who would be in the service of the king, is a responsibility that we have to take seriously, and that we should feel a certain compulsion, a certain urgency in performing this responsibility. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about keeping his charge. Again, Deuteronomy 11:1, and now we're going to roll through the rest of Deuteronomy. You shall therefore love Yahweh your Elohim and keep his charge, that which has been entrusted to each one of you. Namely, that relationship based upon, keeping his covenant, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments all the days. So keeping his charge is equivalent to guard his trust. Again, meaning the covenant. There was a popular singer so many years ago who sang a song called Guard the Trust. Some of you may remember that song. Who was that? That was Steve Camp sang the song Guard the Trust. And he's kind of singing a song about what Paul was telling Timothy, to guard the trust, to do that which you're responsible for doing as a minister of the gospel. So, moving on, verses 2 and 3, who's he speaking to here? He says, therefore, because of all that he talked about in previous chapters about the irresponsibility and the misappropriation of the things that the sons of Israel were given, where they decided to rebel against him, and the consequences of that rebellion, he says, therefore, you love Yahweh your Elohim and keep his charge. And so know this day, verses 2 and 3, that I am not speaking with your sons, who have not known and who have not seen the discipline of Yahweh your Elohim, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his outstretched arm, and his signs and his wonders which he did in the midst of Mitzrayim, to Pharaoh, the king of Mitzrayim, and to all his land. And what Moses is saying here is that this is a new generation. All of the men 20 years and older who first, who were at Sinai and heard the words of the Father, they all died out with the exception of 2. They all died out in the wilderness. But their sons back at the time of Sinai heard the words of the Father. And so now their sons are, like 40, 50, 60 years old now, and they're now getting ready to enter into the land, even though their parents were disqualified from it. And so he's saying, I'm not speaking with your sons. He's speaking to this generation of people that are about to enter the land. It wasn't to your sons, but you were sons, is what he's saying, when I gave these instructions to your fathers, and then they disobeyed. So Moses is speaking to this new generation who were not present at the Exodus. I said that wrong in the statement. Moses is speaking to the generation that was present at the Exodus, but they were all children at the time. But he wasn't speaking, as it were, to those who had been brought up in the wilderness, who were born and brought up in the wilderness. He's saying, I'm not speaking to those people. He's speaking to the people who actually saw and heard the things. And that's his point here. He is speaking to the whole community. But he's saying specifically that he's speaking to those who heard these things as a means of being able to testify and to bring agreement as to, oh yes, you did say those things. I was there. I was a kid, at my father's right hand. And I heard those things that the Father spoke. And so Moses is making an appeal that this is who he's speaking to, the people who actually heard and experience these things back at Sinai. He says, and those of you who saw what he did to Mitzrayim's army, to its horses and its chariots, when he made the water of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, to engulf them while they were pursuing you. And Yahweh completely destroyed them. And what he did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place. And so these children, as they're growing up, they saw all those things. They saw the miracles in Egypt. They saw Pharaoh's army being destroyed in the midst of the waters of the sea. And they saw what he was doing in the wilderness, the manna and the water from the rock, and and all, but also the judgments that Yahweh brought to the rebellious. And so these people that are about to enter the land saw all these things and can bear witness to them. And furthermore, he says, still speaking of these people, and what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, when the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, their households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them among all Israel. And the account of this, if you want to look it up, is in Numbers 16. We don't really have time to read through this, although I would like to. But Numbers 16 tells this whole story. But your own eyes, and here's the point of what Moses is saying, but your own eyes have seen all the great work of Yahweh which he did. So they can bear witness to the things that the Father did and all the miracles and wonders and so forth. And so now they're being given instruction that to take their parents' example of disobedience and not walk in that path. But they are to see how the Father worked in the lives of the sons of Israel and follow the right way, the way that the Father is instructing them to obey the commandments of the covenant which he made with them. Verses 8 and 9, you shall therefore keep. Therefore is kind of the resulting action based upon what was said previously. Because Yahweh had done all these great wonders, and they themselves had seen all those wonders with their own eyes, therefore you shall keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, so that you may prolong your days on the land which Yahweh swore to your fathers to give to them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so this is the motivation for his people to obey his commandments, is because of all that the Father has done in the past. And this is why it's so important that we remember our history. And we already talked about this a little bit today, that we're to remember our history, remember what the Father has done for not only our ancestors and all those throughout all those generations up till today, but also what he's done for us today in our own lifetime. We have to remember those things, and this is why it's important to for some of you to do some journaling and write down the things that the Father speaks to you, and write down the things that the Father does for you, and the dreams or the visions that he gives you, so that we don't forget all that stuff. If we forget, we're gonna forget why it is that we're serving him. So if we can remember these things that he's done for us and for our forefathers, then we can be strong in it, and we can know and be assured that the Father is at work in and among us to deliver us from our enemies, to help us in our time of need, to walk us down the path of righteousness and in that narrow way that he's prescribed for us. And then we'll be strong, and then we'll be able to prolong our days, which is what he was telling that generation, that they would prolong their days. Otherwise, if your life and your days aren't prolonged, what are they? They're cut short, right? And that happens through disobedience. Our lives get cut short. But if we're walking in the blessing of obedience to his covenant commandments, then he's going to prolong our days and let us see long life on the earth. Hallelujah. And this also alludes to the eternal life. You know, it has that double meaning here where he talks about life. And we talked about that again before in some of the previous chapters. But life is a consequence of obedience. It's kind of the summary of the whole thing. And when we walk in obedience and we're strong and we remember what the Father did and do what he tells us to do, then our life is going to be prolonged, even unto eternal life, which was promised. And so Deuteronomy 11:10, for the land, now he's going to talk a little bit about this land. I told you at the beginning of the study that we'd talk about the land. For the land into which you are entering to possess it, it's not like the land of Mitzrayim, from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it by your foot, like a vegetable garden. So I had to think about this expression. What do you mean? What does he mean that they watered it by foot? You don't really, like, we don't water our garden by foot, but it's an expression, okay? Again, it's a metaphor, and it means you had to water it manually. You had to go get the water from the river or whatever your source of water was and carry it over and water. You know, when they were in Egypt, they had to water their gardens manually or by foot, as he puts it here, and that's what he's talking about, like a vegetable garden. But that's what we do. You know, we either turn the hose on to water our vegetables, or we take, or Kathy actually, not so much me, but she takes, you know, that pitcher of water and it goes out and waters by hand each of the plants. But that's the way it was in Mitzrayim, but that's not the way it was going to be for the sons of Israel when they came to the new land. He says, but the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven.
Hallelujah.
A land for which Yahweh your Elohim cares. The eyes of Yahweh your Elohim are always on it from the beginning even unto the end of the year. And so, you know, in the promised land, they're not going to have to set up irrigation systems and hoses and techniques for bringing water, but the Father is going to bring down the rain from heaven, so they won't have to do that. It's going to be easy.
Hallelujah.
It's not like all easy, you know. I mean, there's still work to be done, but the things that were very difficult when we're living in the exile are going to be easy in the promised land, because the Father's going to provide those things. It shall come about if you listen carefully. And so now he moves on, because now this land, which is the Father is going to take care of and give rain in its season, is what our ancestors were getting ready to possess. And so he says, if it shall come about, transitioning into another thought here about the blessings and curses. He says, if you listen obediently to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love Yahweh your Elohim and to serve him with all your heart and your soul. And we looked last week at the other verbs that expressed what our obligations and requirements are to partake in the covenant. You know, we're to love him, serve him, obey his commandments. We're to, what were some of the other ones? We're to swear by his name. We're to cling to him, and those kind of things. And so when we do all of those things, when we make Elohim first in our lives and uppermost in our thoughts and in our actions, then he's going to bring certain promises or fulfill certain promises. He says here that he will give the rain for your land in its season, the early and the late rain, that you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil, and he will give grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. And so this is why the land, we're not going to have to water it by hand or by foot, as Moses says. But the Father is going to bless the land and bring all that the land needs, not only the crops, but even the grass of the field for our animals who are grazing to eat from. So hallelujah, and you will eat and be satisfied. And so he says next, now beware, in verses 16 and 17, beware that your hearts are not deceived. Because this is the way we get drawn away from Elohim, as everything starts to look good and we forget that he's the one that provided and he's the one that's going to bring these blessings about. Beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them. Because that's what happens when we take our eyes off of Him, is that we start looking to other sources of help, and the nations look to other so-called gods that neither see nor hear, but they expect their other gods, the things made out of wood and stone and metal, to answer their prayers, but they never do. Or the anger of Yahweh will be kindled against you, and He will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which Yahweh is giving you. I find it interesting that He says you will perish quickly from the good land, and I think each of those generations that turned in rebellion against the Father and began to worship the gods of the nations around them, their generation perished quickly. But I find it amazing that the Father, for so many hundreds of years, patiently waited generation after generation. A few of those generations turned back to Him, but most of them were in rebellion, and they quickly perished. But He waited, I don't know how many hundreds of years, something like 800 years or thereabout, is what's coming to my mind right now. From the time they entered into the land until He finally just said enough's enough, and He cast them out into the exile. I mean, 800 years of this continuous rebellion against Him, He waited so patiently.
So patient.
And so this is a warning to us that we're not deceived. I wanted to just read, I got one slide here from Psalm 73 that kind of gives a description of the good life, or at least our perception of the good life of unbelievers, and how sometimes our heart can lead us astray because, Asaph wrote this psalm, and he's talking about, when he looks at all the nations around them, he says, in verses 2 through 5, he says, "But as for me," this is Asaph, "my feet came close to stumbling. My steps had almost slipped." It's because he was being deceived by what he was seeing with his eyes among the nations. He says, "I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pains in their death, and their body is fat," meaning healthy. "They are not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like mankind." And so Asaph is looking at these pagans, and he's saying, they got a good life. They don't have any of the troubles that I have, because, the Father is always causing me to be faced against trials and troubles, because the Father is testing my character, and He's trying to bring me to better be like Him. And so again, in verses 12 through 13, Asaph continues. He says, "Behold, these are the wicked, and always at ease. They have increased in wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure, and washed my hands in innocence." This is how our heart can deceive us, and why we need to be careful and beware that we don't allow what is going on among the nations to affect us, and to cause us to be envious of them and then turn to their ways. The heart can do that if we're not careful, if we don't have our eyes focused on Him. Asaph goes on to say, it was trouble to me until I entered into the sanctuary of Yahweh, and there I saw their end. He goes on to describe their end is that their end is coming quickly, that their end is not to a good place, but their end is destruction. And I think, my interpretation of when he entered into the sanctuary, I think he saw the burnt offerings at the sanctuary, and I think that's where he got the insight that the burnt offerings representing the destruction, the complete destruction of the animal, whether it be a sin offering or whatever, is what the wicked are going to go through, because those sin offerings were a substitute for His people. Because the wages of sin is death, and those who are engaged in sin are going to perish like the animals that we use as substitutes for atonement. And so he had a glimpse of the end of the wicked people in seeing those animals being burnt completely up and destroyed. And that's where he realized that that's the end of the wicked. But it doesn't have to be that way for us. And this is why we are to walk in righteousness. Because the end for us is atonement, it's everlasting life, it's life in the kingdom with our Messiah. So the good life of the unbelievers can be a source of deceiving us, and therefore we are not to turn our hearts away from the Father and go and serve other gods. Because if we do, then we will perish quickly from the good land which Yahweh is giving to us. So moving on in Deuteronomy 11, verses 18 and 19, you shall therefore set these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. And they shall be as frontlets on your forehead, constant reminders. We are to set up for ourselves, as the Father instructed us, constant reminders, and this is where the tzitziot come into play as well. The reminders of what the Father has called us to walk in His righteous ways. And when we enter into our property or into our house, we are reminded by the things. When we write the commandments on our doorposts and on our gates, we're reminded that this is the way that the Father has called us to. Talking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you rise up. So constantly reiterating and rereading and talking about and meditating on the words that the Father has given us as promise. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your sons may be multiplied on the land. Yahweh swore to your fathers to give them as long as the heavens remain above the earth. And so our days are going to be multiplied if we follow faithfully in this course of action that the Father is calling us to. 4, if you are careful to keep all this commandment, which I am commanding you to do, to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all His ways, to hold fast to Him, then Yahweh will drive out all these nations from before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. So the promise that we read over and over again, not only in Deuteronomy, but throughout the Scriptures, is that the Father wants to bless us and to do good by us. But we have our part. We have a responsibility to walk in. We need to guard that trust and walk in this way so that the Father can bless us, because He's not going to be duplicitous toward us. If He judges everyone according to their works, if He's going to judge the nations according to their rebellious ways, then He has to judge everybody by their works. If our works are like the works of the pagans, then He's going to have to judge us in the same way that He judges the pagans. So it's incumbent upon us as believers not only to believe what we believe and to believe the truth, but to walk in it. Because the Father does not judge by two different standards. And therefore He will drive out the nations from before you, and you will dispossess the nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours, according to the promise made to Abraham. Your border will be from the wilderness, which is actually, the wilderness refers to the south, the Negev, to Lebanon, which is in the north. So from south to north, and from the river Euphrates, which is east. And I don't know if you all realize that the promised land includes all the way to the Euphrates. Our ancestors never inherited that whole property all the way to the Euphrates. They only inherited part of that. But the promise is all the way from the river Euphrates as far as the Western Sea, meaning the Mediterranean. And in Deuteronomy, in Genesis, I think it's chapter 12, He describes the river of Egypt as that western boundary. So it's the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the river of Egypt, which is the western boundary of all that the sons of Israel are going to inherit. And we will, when the Messiah comes, we are going to inherit all of that property. because it all belongs to him. It was promised. And so these are the blessings and the curses that the Father is making to us. And so verses 26 to 28, which is actually in the Torah portions a new reading. It's called Re'eh, or see. It's, that's the title of the reading from Deuteronomy 11:26 through something like 14, or maybe the end of 13. I can't remember where that reading ends. But this is another reading. But the reason that these are connected is because he was already, in the previous few verses, he was already talking about the blessings of obedience. If you obey this covenant commandment, then these are the things the Father's going to do for you. But if you don't, he's going to destroy you like the rest of the nations. And so, see, I am setting before you today blessing and curse. The blessing when you listen to the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I am commanding you today, and the curse if you do not listen to the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, but turn aside from the way which I am commanding you today, by following other gods which you have not known. And so therefore, like we've talked about before, the curse of the Torah isn't that the Torah is cursed. The curse of the Torah is that the Torah promises curses on those who disobey. And we don't want to be those people who disobey the Torah. We want to fall into the category of those who are blessed. The blessings are promised to those who obey all of the Torah. Again, a point that is often missed among our brothers and sisters in some of the Christian churches. The blessing and the curse. It shall come about when Yahweh your Elohim brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not across the Jordan, west of the way toward the sunset, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh? And so I have a slide here that is a map. It's actually a picture. It's not even a map. It's a picture of the city of Shechem. And Shechem, and this is where the two mountains are. Shechem is north, maybe 20 miles north of Jerusalem, roughly, I'm guessing. It's in the northern part of Israel. I think it falls within the realm of what became Samaria, the northern kingdom. And what's interesting to me about that is that the blessings and the curses were performed from these two mountains, which the illustration here shows it's only a mile apart between these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And so it was actually like an amphitheater, because the mountains are up here and then the land lies low, and when the people from this side spoke, you could hear them from the other mountain a mile away. There are some natural amphitheaters, and we've all probably experienced that. Mountains where you speak and then the echo comes back. That kind of a thing, where people can hear you miles away and you can hear them from miles away. And this is why the blessings were given on Mount Gerizim and the curses. But the other interesting thing that I realized was that these two mountains, the blessings and the curses, occurred in the land that later became the northern kingdom, or Samaria, the land of the Samaritans, because they were the ones that chose to follow a different path and to split off from Judah and to have their own religious places. They had their own places of sacrifice and worship, and the fact that the blessings and the curses were given here, it seems to me, would have been a constant reminder that they were outside of the blessings, because the blessings come upon those who walk in the Father's ways, but the northern kingdom didn't. They walked away and they created their own worship places, right? And they didn't go to Jerusalem, which is where the Father put his name, and the place where he commanded all of Israel to come. And so I think that these two mountains were a constant reminder. At least it seems to me that they must have been, because there they were, right in the middle of Samaria, where the blessings and the curses were given. And anyone who wanted to go back and read the blessings and the curses would have realized that they were wrong in establishing their own places of worship apart from the ones that the Father had given. And so now, here's my last slide. So I know we're getting restless here. This is the last one until I get to my summary slide. Okay, so verses 31 and 32. For you are about to cross the Jordan, to go in to possess the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you. And you shall possess it and live in it. And you shall be careful to do all the statutes and the judgments which I am setting before you today. So again, a summary of what he's been talking about really throughout the book of Deuteronomy is that his people need to be careful to obey the statutes. And that's where we're going to find life and blessing from the Father. It's in carefully keeping all of the laws, right rulings, the statutes, the commandments of the Father. And so here's my summary slide. We've been given a solemn responsibility, keeping the charge, which must, and by which we must guard with all diligence the things that the Father has given us by way of instructions. This is the way to walk in it. The Torah of the covenant is the basis for our walk before Elohim, and therefore Yahweh has made He's made great and precious promises, mistype there, to those who remain loyal and faithful to Him. The promises were given to us, and when we walk in that covenant, and we take that as a solemn responsibility, then, and therefore remain loyal and faithful to Him, then He's going to cause us to enter into the land, into the kingdom of Elohim. So, final statement, let's be careful to obey all His statutes and judgments, which He has given us. This is the way into the kingdom of Elohim. And that's what I have from Deuteronomy 11. And I hope that, that first half of the teaching seems so important to me, that we're to guard the trust, that we're to, to really be diligent about keeping that solemn responsibility that He's given to us to keep. And even Paul in the New Testament many times over reflects that teaching from Deuteronomy. So your response to the teaching and to Deuteronomy 11, questions, comments, what do you have to bring?